Paris, September 1783. 2 years after the last major British defeat of the American Revolutionary War, British and American diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris, formally ending the war and recognizing the United States as independent from Great Britain. The treaty is a humiliation for the British and a triumph for the Americans. A triumph that was won by soldiers and sailors with muskets and cannons, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, by bankers and investors with loans and financial innovations. Today we're going to explore the integral role that money and financial innovation played in the American Revolutionary War, a war, like all wars, that had to be financed in order to be won. This is the butterfly's wing, where we look at seemingly small things with unexpectedly large impacts. The principal challenge for any monetary system is ensuring the right amount of money exists within the system. Too little, and the money won't adequately function as a means of exchange, and growth will be limited. Too much, and inflation results, potentially rendering the money worthless. From their earliest days, Britain's faraway American colonies suffered from a lack of gold and silver coinage, known as specie. This lack of coinage was caused in part by Britain's mercantilist policies that attempted to siphon specie from the colonies to hoard it in Britain. Since the British government forbade coins from being minted in its colonies and enacted policies aimed at keeping specie in Britain, most of the coins that did circulate in British North America were of Spanish or Portuguese origin. For this reason, American colonists often used the dollar, a Spanish monetary unit, instead of the British pound as their principal monetary unit. This is why, even today, U.S. currency is referred to as dollars, not pounds. One workaround for this lack of specie was the use of commodities as a means of exchange. Tobacco was one common form of commodity money, but tobacco and other commodities made for cumbersome, inexact forms of money. This lack of money strained colonial economies, especially in times of war, when colonies needed to increase their military spending. Innovation was required, innovation that came in the form of paper money. French and British North American colonies became the first governmental authorities outside China to issue paper money. Quebec was first in 1685. When faced with a lack of available money with which to pay its soldiers, the colony issued so-called card money, made out of modified playing cards. 5 years later, during the 9 Years' War, Massachusetts became the first British governmental authority to issue paper money, when it paid for a failed military expedition against Quebec by issuing paper currency. This practice was often repeated by Massachusetts and other colonies. In retrospect, it should come as little surprise that 17th century North America became the first place in the Western world to use paper money, since both Britain and France maintained mercantilist policies with their North American colonies that restricted the supply of precious metal money there. At the same time, military conflict between Britain and France and with native peoples was common there. Conflict that was expensive and required some form of money to make financing possible. British colonial governments usually established paper currencies by issuing so-called bills of credit. Bills of credit were essentially paper denominations of money issued to pay debt. A colony would promise to accept these bills of credit back in the future at face value as a form of payment for taxes or bond purchases. Bills of credit usually could not be exchanged on demand for fixed amounts of specie. It was the expectation that a bill of credit could be used at a later date to pay the government that created its value. This faith allowed bills of credit to essentially circulate as money alongside specie and commodity money. Private merchants also issued bills of credit in their own names, or in the name of a company. Again, paper denominations of money were issued, this time by a merchant, that could be returned at a later date to receive payment in specie. Private bills of credit often included a time delay provision on repayment. A bill of credit without such a provision was said to be payable on sight, meaning it could be exchanged immediately for specie. But other bills might have a term of, say, 90 days. Meaning, if a bearer presented it to the merchant who had issued it, that merchant would then have up to 90 days from the presentation date to exchange his bill for its face value in specie. A merchant might issue new bills of credit to pay for a ship. a cargo of tobacco and other American commodities, and a crew that would then sail to Britain, where the commodities would be sold and the proceeds used to buy finished goods, that would then be sent back to America to be sold there. Once the dust had settled, the merchant, if all went well, would have enough hard money to pay off his original bills of credit, with a tidy profit left over for himself. As a practical matter, only a very wealthy merchant with a very good reputation would be trusted enough for people to accept his bills as payment. This made a merchant's reputation and business relationships essential to his success. Because the British government, as part of its mercantilist policies, prohibited banks from operating in the colonies, bills of credit were the form of credit in colonial America. Bills of credit were also one of the principal forms of money in the colonies. But a consistent problem with bills of credit was inflation. When too much paper money was introduced, people became unwilling to accept it at face value. So paper money tended to depreciate over time, becoming worth less than its face value. The real value of paper money also tended to fluctuate based on geography. For example, a bill that was issued in Massachusetts would usually have a higher value there than in, say, Georgia, because a Georgian would have to go to the trouble of transporting the bill to Massachusetts in order to redeem it. This problem was compounded for bills of credit that were not payable on site. The end result was a colonial paper money non-bank credit system that was innovative, elaborate, and in many ways, terrible. In 1775, when war broke out between Britain and her American colonies, the colonies needed to dramatically increase their military spending. They responded in the usual way, each issuing their own bills of credit. The newly formed Continental Congress also issued its own paper currency, called the Continental. So congressional, colonial, and private issues of paper money all circulated, alongside commodity money and limited amounts of mostly Spanish specie. Inflation soon became a huge problem for these paper currencies, for at least 4 reasons. Colonial paper currencies that weren't backed by precious metal naturally tended to depreciate. Congress in the colonies didn't coordinate their issues of paper money and created too much. The British actively introduced counterfeit paper money in an attempt to deflate the currencies further. If the Americans lost the war, the British would almost certainly not allow American paper currency to be honored in any way, which further discouraged people from accepting it at face value. The best tool colonies had to combat inflation with their paper currencies was taxation. But taxation wasn't a viable solution to the problem of inflation during the Revolutionary War for at least 4 reasons. Since the war was fought largely in response to what was considered to be an unfair tax burden, higher taxes weren't a politically viable solution. Especially early in the war, colonist loyalties were divided, so colonies, later states, didn't want to antagonize them with higher taxes. The war was long, more than 8 years, and expensive, making it impractical for taxes to be high enough to keep inflation in check. The colonies, later states, didn't grant Congress the power to tax. While initially, paper money was sufficient to fund the rebel war effort, in the long run, what was really needed was specie. And the only way the Americans could hope to obtain a significant amount of specie was to look abroad. France, technically at peace with Britain, but a longtime rival still stinging from defeat in the 7 Years' War, was a logical place to look for funds. So in March 1776, Congress appointed one of its former delegates, Connecticut merchant Silas Deane, as a secret envoy to the French court at Versailles. Deane succeeded in obtaining a grant and loan from France, as well as assurances from French officials that they would look the other way when Americans bought military supplies in France, technically a violation of France's official neutrality at the beginning of the conflict. Throughout the war, Congress received multiple loans or grants from France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, who were motivated by a desire for profit, as well as a desire to weaken Britain. A great deal of the weapons and other war material used by the Continental Army and Navy came from these 3 countries. The importance of French, Spanish, and Dutch support for the Patriot cause cannot be overstated. But the initial influx of mostly French money wasn't sufficient by itself. So in October 1776, Congress established a Continental Loan Office that offered for sale $5 million in certificates, essentially bonds, paying 4 and later 6% interest. Money from France was used to pay the interest. Congress, through a bit of financial maneuvering, had found a way to use the French loan to raise even more money from the general public. The mastermind behind the Continental Loan Certificates, as well as much of the financial innovation of the Revolution, was a Philadelphia merchant named Robert Morris. He's perhaps the most important figure of the American Revolution who isn't widely known today. Morris was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, thanks to his extensive international trade network. In 1775, he was chosen to represent Pennsylvania as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Given his extensive knowledge of international trade and finance, Congress selected him to serve on 2 important committees, the Secret Committee of Correspondence and the Secret Committee of Trade, which together were responsible for diplomatic, trade, and military relations with foreign countries. Morris became the principal congressional official in charge of obtaining supplies for the Continental Army and Navy. Sometimes to facilitate purchases, Morris would pay with bills of credit in his own name, since at times his personal creditworthiness was viewed more favorably than that of Congress. Throughout the war, his personal bills of credit circulated so widely they became known simply as Morris notes, or sometimes long bobs or short bobs, depending on whether they had a long or short time delay provision on repayment. One of the great successes of the secret committees and of Silas Deane was the securement of a large shipment of military supplies from France, used to resupply General Horatio Gates' army, which on October 7, 1777, defeated a British army under General John Burgoyne at Saratoga, New York. Saratoga was the first great patriot victory of the war, a victory that was crucial to convincing France to officially recognize the United States and openly join the war effort 4 months later. In June 1779, Spain also declared war on Great Britain. While French and Spanish involvement in the war effort was a huge help to the Americans, it still did not solve the problem of rampant inflation with American paper money. By March 1780, the situation was so bad, Congress voted to officially devalue the Continental at a rate of 40 to 1. In May 1780, the Americans suffered one of their worst defeats of the war, when the city of Charleston fell to General Sir Henry Clinton. The loss of this important port city did not bode well for the Patriot War effort, or the value of American paper money. In the months after Charleston, Robert Morris, while on a hiatus from Congress, banded together with other Pennsylvania merchants to form a private proto-bank called the Bank of Pennsylvania. This early so-called bank wasn't quite what we'd consider a bank in the modern sense, an institution that collects money from savers on an ongoing basis to lend at a profitable rate of interest. Instead, the Bank of Pennsylvania collected £315,000 worth of money from investors, who in return received from the bank notes payable in 6 months that bore a 6% rate of interest. Essentially, the Bank of Pennsylvania was an institution devised to facilitate a short-term loan from private individuals to Congress. When Morris informed Congress of the merchants' plan, they accepted it and officially backed the bank. The creation of the Bank of Pennsylvania was an important first step for Americans into the world of banking, something that had been expressly forbidden to them under British rule. The Bank of Pennsylvania succeeded in obtaining short-term funding for Congress. Around the same period, Congress's paper currency, the Continental, which Congress had already officially devalued to just 2.5% its original value, continued to depreciate, to the point that it essentially stopped circulating as money at all. The phrase, "not worth the Continental," became common. The failure of the Continental and the success of the Bank of Pennsylvania laid the groundwork for a much more ambitious banking project, the chartering in May 1781 of America's first national bank, the Bank of North America, a forerunner of the first and second banks of the United States and of the Federal Reserve. The plan for the Bank of North America was based on ideas expressed by Continental Army officer and future Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris, who in June 1781 agreed to serve in the newly created position of Superintendent of Finance for Congress. Morris and Hamilton's ideas for an American national bank were heavily inspired by the Bank of England. England had chartered its central bank in 1694 to help finance military spending during the 9 Years' War, the same conflict that led Massachusetts to begin the practice of issuing paper money in the colonies. Morris and Hamilton understood full well how effective the Bank of England was at financing the British war machine. They wanted to make use of similar mechanisms to finance the American war effort. Although the Bank of North America was chartered by Congress, it would be a private bank owned by shareholders that would receive deposits from and make loans to members of the public. As the national bank, it would also hold Congress's funds and make loans to Congress as needed. And it would receive the exclusive right to issue banknotes backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. These new notes would become the new official paper currency of Congress, and, unlike the now worthless Continentals, these notes would be convertible to specie, backed by the initial investment of shareholders, the deposits of Congress and members of the public, and interest earned on loans made by the bank. By structuring the Bank of North America as a joint public-private venture, Morris and Hamilton created a framework that was stronger than an exclusively public or private bank would have been. The bank's charter was approved in May 1781. To acquire the initial funds required for the bank to open its doors, 1,000 shares were offered for sale at $400 apiece. Once enough money was raised, Morris would have his bank, but he would have to wait. Also in 1781, France extended Congress another financial lifeline in the form of a loan worth 6 million livres, but stipulated that the money be spent in France. This was achieved through the use of bills on France, notes that could circulate anywhere, but could only be exchanged for specie in France. American representatives used these bills to purchase war supplies in France. Meanwhile, French Army and Navy officials, who were by now fighting openly in America, also used bills on France to buy goods and services from Americans. Since these bills could only be exchanged for specie in France, they tended to be valued most highly in France, or by American merchants who had business to conduct in France. These bills depreciated when they circulated amongst average Americans, especially as the French military used more and more of them to purchase food and other supplies for their forces stationed in America. Toward the end of the war, the role of the French military became increasingly crucial to the American war effort. In August 1781, the Continental Army's commander-in-chief, General George Washington, learned of the arrival in the Chesapeake of a fleet of 29 French warships carrying 3,000 French soldiers, commanded by Vice Admiral de Grasse. Meanwhile, a British army, under General Lord Cornwallis, was stationed at Yorktown on the Virginia coast. Washington and his French allies agreed now was the time for a joint Franco-American attack on Cornwallis, but they would have to act fast. De Grasse's fleet was on orders to return to the Caribbean in 2 months' time, and Cornwallis would only be on the coast for a short time before transporting some of his troops to reinforce British-held New York City. Washington's troops, who were stationed in Newport, Rhode Island, preparing for an assault on New York City that would never come, were dangerously near the point of mutiny. The general feared they would not make the long march to Yorktown unless they were first paid with hard coin. None of the numerous forms of paper money circulating at the time would do. It fell to Congress's Superintendent of Finance, Robert Morris, who had developed a strong working relationship with Washington, to obtain the specie required. Morris negotiated with de Grasse for a short-term loan of $20,000 worth of coin carried by the French fleet. He then obtained another $6,000 from various other sources, relying in part on his personal credit. This money was then distributed to the troops who would fight the Yorktown campaign. It was the first time any of them had been paid in coin for their services to the army. By October 1781, a Franco-American force of 20,000 men succeeded in surrounding and defeating Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown. It was the second and final time during the Revolution that an entire British army surrendered. When British Prime Minister Lord North heard of Cornwallis's surrender, he exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." But it was not over, and would not truly be over for another 2 years. While the British Parliament voted in March 1782 to cease hostilities and no more significant fighting took place, American independence could only be secured at the negotiation table. Until then, British forces continued a limited occupation in places like New York City, Charleston, and Savannah. Washington maintained his forces in New Windsor, New York, about 60 miles north of New York City. While Congress's representatives spent the next 2 years in Paris negotiating the terms of independence, it fell to Washington to keep his army intact, to prevent the British from changing their minds, and it fell to Robert Morris to keep this army paid. In January 1782, Morris finally had enough funding to open his beloved Bank of North America. He used money loaned by France, secured by another loan from the Dutch Republic, to purchase a 63.3% stake in the bank on Congress's behalf. William Bingham, one of the richest men in America, thanks in part to his investments in American privateerships, purchased 9.5% of the shares. The rest were purchased by other wealthy individuals, including foreigners who were allowed to own shares, but only as non-voting members. This initial capitalization for the bank, mostly foreign money, helped establish credibility for the new financial system. The bank then began issuing paper notes, called Bank of North America certificates, that could be exchanged for specie, obtained from the bank through its initial stock offering, from depositors, including Congress, and from interest earned on loans. These certificates replaced the by now worthless Continentals as the official paper currency of Congress. Bank of North America certificates had less of a problem with depreciation because, unlike Continentals, they were backed by the bank's reserves and could be converted to specie. Though the goal of the bank was to create enough confidence in the new paper certificates that people would just use them as money and not bother to exchange them for specie. This way, the bank could safely loan out more money at interest than it actually held in its vault. To help build confidence in the new institution, the bank's employees made it a point to frequently move boxes marked silver all about their headquarters building, where they would be publicly seen, boxes that may or may not have actually been filled with silver. On its first day of operation, the bank issued a $100,000 loan to Congress, which was the main mechanism for introducing the new banknotes into circulation. At the end of its first year in operation, the bank had been successful enough to pay out almost a 9% dividend to its shareholders, including its largest shareholder, Congress. Ultimately, Congress was unable to repay the bank the full amount of money it had borrowed. As part of a final settlement, Congress forfeited its shares in the bank, meaning the bank no longer had any official relationship with the government. While the Bank of North America ultimately failed as a national bank for the United States, it continued to function successfully as a private enterprise. After multiple mergers and renamings, it became part of Wells Fargo. On September 3rd, 1783, American and British representatives finally signed the Treaty of Paris, officially recognizing the independence of the United States. The war was now truly over. It was the first war in history to be financed primarily with paper money. Over time, we've tended to gloss over the role of foreign powers, financial incentive, and debt in securing American independence, preferring instead to focus on revolutionaries, Enlightenment-era political ideals, and the military courage and sacrifice of American soldiers and statesmen. There's something unromantic, even unseemly, about introducing the topic of money into a conversation about the Revolution. But I'm reminded of something Richard Peters, a member of Congress's Board of War, said to General Washington while they and Robert Morris were planning the Yorktown campaign. "I can do everything with money, nothing without it." Thanks for watching. Instead, it would be the Eastern Greek alphabet that would see a meteoric rise first, thanks to its most famous user, Alexander the Great. In 330 BC, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, then portions of India, ultimately establishing an empire that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas. We often portray Alexander's conquest as a showdown between East and West, but it was also a showdown between ancient writing systems. with the Eastern Greek alphabet ultimately displacing the cuneiform writing used in Persia and the hieroglyphic writing used in Egypt.